Yo. How's it going, guys? I'm talking directly into the camera today. We have very little to no script, because this is something that I just had to sit down and talk about immediately. It's a Substack blog, and also fellow YouTuber, by the name of Pens and Poison. She is a Columbia English Literature graduate, who has been making waves recently, discussing the problem with modern English literature and the problem with books and reading in today's contemporary cultural climate. And I have a lot of issues with what she says. I think she's wrong about a lot of stuff. And so I figured I would open the floor for debate today with a double crossover feature. This video reacting to a couple of her videos, which is going to be largely, aformal. It's going to be off-rip, no script. And then a longer essay responding to some of the claims that she... My camera is shaking like crazy. And then a longer essay responding to some of the claims that she makes more broadly on my blog. And that's going to be a lot more about English literature and what I think about academia. I'm actually at a very similar point in my academic journey to where she was when she quit academia and started to do her own thing. She has a undergraduate and a master's in English literature from Columbia. I have an honours degree, a double honours in comparative literature and film studies from King's College London, and I am studying a master's in investigative journalism at an undisclosed location because I don't want to get murdered outside my campus. But yeah, so the large theme that she has taken up on is that literature has been co-opted by the woke mob and radical Marxists, and we need to get it back to the humanities. It's about humanism, it's about arts and beauty and personal expression, and, definitely an opinion to have, having done presumably 4 to 5 years of literary education in academia. But I really want to take a look at this because I think it's indicative of a broader problem when it comes to how little people have an understanding of what academia is and why we engage as academics and as scholars with these aspects of theory. It's very easy to write off things like Marxism, Leninism, formalism, feminism, critical race theory, all of these things as woke nonsense that can never be applied to real life. But as a person who had a great time engaging with those things in university and finds a number of them very interesting and very relevant to all aspects of life, I think it's really important that we give these sort of schools of thought a fair shake rather than writing them off because they don't agree with our worldview. And in the spirit of that, I'm actually going to be talking about humanism a lot because from what I can ascertain from the video, that is her worldview and the way that she believes literature should be approached. So I'm going to make an effort to really talk about humanism, at least in the broad sense and what I think the pros and cons are of it, because it would be very hypocritical of me to sit here and say, well, you should give this way of approaching literature a chance if I don't then do the same to you. Now, one thing I do need to specify is that I'm not here to talk about her actual fictional writing. She writes a number of poetry collections. I have not read them, because I cannot get them for free. And I don't pay money for anything, because I'm a college student. So, for the sake of argument, let's assume they're fine, let's assume they're good. That might be a future video if this does well. And if the article does well, that might be something we come to in the future. But for now, this is not about her poetry. That's saved for another day. So yeah, I'm going to react to the main video she has pinned on her channel at the minute. It's sort of like a channel trailer, which is why English departments hate literature. That's what's on the agenda for today. So fucking buckle in. Because it's going to be... Yeah, buckle in because it's going to be a thick one today. Fuck, that was class. Yeah, it's one of those days. I got the headphones on. I fucking hate wearing my headphones on 2 ears. So that's why it's off the back there. But yeah, we're gonna be... Let's take a look. Let's get into it. It's on my monitor over here.
I thought I was going to Columbia to study literature. I was very, very wrong. I had just achieved my lifelong dream of studying literature at one of the best universities in the world, especially for the humanistic tradition.
Okay, so she mentions that Columbia is one of the best universities in the world for the humanistic tradition. Columbia is one of the best universities in the world, period. But I'm not going to sit here and play semantics and that, like, that's a real argument. But, you know, for the sake of my audience, who may not know, and for the people who want me to engage with this tradition, I think it's only fair that I actually spell out what humanism is. So, largely, humanism is a very different type of approach to understanding the world, and especially when it comes to literature, it's very different than the other two main schools of thought, which is the very dogmatic aspects of literary theory, and then the very hard and fast rules of psychoanalytics, right? So they're the two. If you go to any literary theory or literary higher education, they will be the two main things that you will learn about. You will have your general theory column, which will be your, formalism, structuralism, Marxist, Leninist, economic theory, postmodernism. And then you'll have your psychoanalytical theory, which is your guys like Freud, your Lacans, a bunch of people who I fucking hate. I tend to engage with the first category a lot more because I find it a much better way of understanding things. However, what I will say is, especially for film, the ideas of psychoanalytic become very, very helpful. Humanism, or the humanistic tradition, or the humanistic approach, is a way of sort of rejecting the more structuralized external aspects of literary criticism and instead engaging with the internal. It's largely focused on the ideas of self-actualization. Maslow, actually, you might have seen the pyramid, put the pyramid up. Maslow is actually a humanist. So it's largely focused on the ideas of self-actualization, and that the our internal understanding of the world is more important is more important than any outward frameworks. This is, on the surface, a fine understanding of literature to take if used sparingly and correctly. It is not, however, like all theory, is not a universal way for understanding literature. That's not something that can happen. It can be applied to a lot of things, but it doesn't universally cover all of the aspects of literature that we deem important. I think the biggest problem I have with humanism is it really disregards the fact that your material conditions shape your perception of reality, and it tries to impose a universal, artistic, and beautiful truth onto the ideas of literature, rather than acknowledging the more polemic aspects of literary tradition. Because inherently, when you dissect a literary text, that is a thing that is polemic. It's about the dialogue and criticism of the written word, right? That's what it is. And you can make this argument that the personal experience of literature is important to understanding the text. More important than possibly the societal conditions that the text is written in, more important than the perceived meaning through literary theory and or the symbolism that's actually in the book. But in my head, that sort of is reductionist to what the literary tradition is, because it removes the idea of teaching literature and understanding literature not only as an exercise of art, but as an exercise of social reality. Because it is, right? When you write a piece of literature, it is inherently ideological. A lot of people like to say that literature has been co-opted by ideology. It can't be co-opted by ideology, because ideology is simply the idea of having a thought. Anyway, the idea of writing literature is inherently ideological because the author is ideological. And if you're going to argue that the author doesn't have any degree of control over their text, rather it is the reader and their own actualized meaning that they ascertain from the text that's more important, I'm going to argue that that's a wickedly underdeveloped way of looking at literature. Because at the end, you've heard the expression that nothing is wrong in literature. Literature's subjective, there's no wrong answers. We'll rip that band-aid off real quick right now. There are wrong answers. You can be woefully and incredibly wrong in literature, because like everything else, literature is based on evidence. If there is no evidence for your reading of a certain text, then it is a fundamental wrong reading, right? So, what do I mean by this? One of the books she mentions later is Great Gatsby. And when we talk about the idea of why Great Gatsby is suited to a critique of capitalism, it is because it is evidenced by the fact that economics and personal wealth and the exploitation of personal wealth plays a central role in the story. In a very similar way, why we argue A Doll's House by Ibsen, which he also mentions, is a feminist text, is because... Oh, fuck, what's the protagonist's name? Put the protagonist's name on screen. Because it's about female agency, and there's a lot of symbolism and a lot of extended metaphor that indicates to us as a reader, that semiotically notes and tips their hat, and says, by the way, this is what we're doing. If you have... It doesn't matter how internalized an interpretation of a text is, if there is little to no evidence for it. Now, that being said, this is not always the case. Because there are sometimes, readings of text that are so transformative that they become seminal in our understanding of text. However, they're also still based on evidence. What her understanding of literary critique is an idea of appreciating the artistry and the actual text within the book, which is formalism, which is a critique which I would bet $6,000 of my own money that they teach at Columbia, because there's no way they fucking do not teach formalism at Columbia. Like, let's keep it a buck. That has to be something that's done. But if you have a rejection of these outside external theorists like feminist critique, Marxist critique, then formalism is a way of engaging with critique of literature by understanding only what is in the text. Look, either way, you can absolutely take a humanist approach to literature. That is your prerogative. However, there are a number of problems with that, and I'm going to get to them, especially towards the end when we start talking about academia structure and specifically the education level of a master's versus a PhD and what that entails. So, we'll come to why I have a problem with this approach a little bit more when we get to that aspect of schooling. Let's get back to the video.
And I was the only weird kid who was good at English, and there weren't that many super advanced English programs at my high school available. I actually made my own little independent study in English where I studied Faulkner. Like, we always talked about the failures of capitalism in The Great Gatsby or the proto-feminism in the Canterbury Tales, and I didn't think that was the point of a lot of these books. Sure, there's obviously some of that in some of these books, but I think there was this kind of hyper-fixation on these very narrow themes, and it was missing the broader point of, literature, again, is this universal tradition that tells us something a little bit more universal. To me, literature and tradition were inseparable. This is a line of thought that I inherited from my favorite poet, T.S. Eliot. He talks about this in his famous essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent.
So, the next sections of the video, which I'm going to largely ignore, are about her own personal high school experience and about the idea of acknowledging tradition. I will actually come to that, hold on. So, yeah, the next part of the video is largely personal. It's about her high school experience and about how English was taught in her high school. I'm not going to touch on that. What I will touch on, though, is that she talks about T.S. Eliot and how important the acknowledgement of tradition is. That doesn't really work if you're rejecting kinds of theory, in my head. And it's to say that the importance of tradition in understanding literature is something that is integral, but you then can't hold the stance that Marxist theory is completely irrelevant to the literary tradition, because Marxist theory has been used in literary critique for ages.
Even on the first day of freshman orientation, something was off. I mean, this was August 2015. I don't know if you guys remember. This was sort of the GOP primaries. Trump was just starting to gain prominence. And there was also a new buzzword on campus around that time, and that was political correctness. So we're sitting in a circle, and the orientation leader says that we're supposed to go around and state our name, where we're from, perspective major, and our pronouns. My pronouns are she, her. Hers? I think I stopped showing up to the latter half of orientation because it was just so ridiculous. There was one where we had to write about our ability, and I think I wrote normal, and I got in really big trouble for that. Don't do that.
I'm also not going to talk about the next bit because it's, again... You might be getting the sense that Pens and Poison is a more conservative-leaning commentator. And when talking about orientation, the minute I heard 2015 and political correctness, I knew it was going to be a complaint about pronouns. Could have seen that shit coming a mile away. What is it with, like, literary people who are against criticism also being TERFs? Like, I don't understand it. She's probably not a TERF, actually. I don't know, but I might not keep that in. But either way, the complaining about pronouns and spaces for trans people, we've heard it 100,000 times before. You know what I mean? Why is it a problem? Why is it? It's just ridiculous.
And I show up to the first day of my freshman English department seminar, and we are given an essay by this guy named Edward Said. This is very strange because in high school I had read basically every single great writer that you could possibly think of, or at least I had heard of every single great writer that you could possibly think of, and I didn't know who Edward Said was, and I didn't know, what poem or what novel we were reading of his, and then I learned that Edward Said is a literary critic. And I thought that was a little bit odd because you don't read literary criticism until you've read actual literature, presumably.
So this is where I take issue. This is where I really start to take issue. She says in high school, I have read or heard of every great literary figure that has ever existed. And then goes on to mention that the first week was about the absolute fucking champion of literary theory, Edward Said. I have, that, you probably can't see it, but if you go up to the Gore Vidal book, that blue one right there is Orientalism by Edward Said. I used Edward Said in nearly every fucking essay I wrote in my second and third years of my undergraduate. And that's largely because I specialized in literature from East and South Asia. But the idea of going around and going, oh, I've heard of all of the great writers of our time and read all of them, and then going, well, I haven't heard of Edward Said, is ridiculous. It is frankly ridiculous. He is one of the most seminal literary critics of all time. Orientalism and Culture and Imperialism are two books that are absolutely must read if you want to get into literary criticism. This, right? Okay, let's also talk about this for a second. This goes on to a broader point that she makes in the video, where she talks about the fact that the literary course at Columbia was largely not literary, but more focused on literary theory, and that she had very few fiction books to read during her time, and it was mostly focused on literary theory. No, okay, so let's address this in the constituent parts that the question has. Number one, were there no literary books? Now, I can't go back to 2015 and get the personal reading list she was handed out and identify her classes, etc., etc., etc. However, what I can do is look at the Columbia reading list as it currently exists, which I will be putting up pictures up here, but I'm looking at it on my monitor right here. So, this is the Spring 2025 distribution list by course for the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia. The first module that you can take is Approaches to Literary Study. It's got some professors. But here we go. This is what's on the reading list and the kind of classes that you do. Beowulf, Shakespeare, Romanticism, Victorian Poetry, Restoration and 18th Century Drama, Jazz and the Literary Imagination, an entire class on Keats, Out of Her Mind American Women's Writing. That's probably a theory class, actually. These all have established criteria for you to be able to understand the class. It's not an aspect of, oh, well, we're only reading theory. In a class on Beowulf, especially about understanding Beowulf to its core, you have to have read Beowulf. You know what I mean? Shakespeare, Chaucer, Keats, Yeats, any of those guys, to fully understand their text, there's no time in the class to read the text. I genuinely cannot fathom what she was expecting, unless she was thinking that it was going to be like high school, where you would go home, read a chapter, come to class, talk about it the next day. That's not what academia is. There is actually no time for that, because it's fundamentally, it's a waste of time. It's a waste, no one cares. the way of dissecting a book requires so much extra information, especially when it comes to theory. You first have to understand the way that the critical framework was formed, understand how the critical framework was implemented, and then identify parts of your text in which the critical framework is acceptable to be used and corroborates the understanding that you think is important in the text, and then also find parts in the text that either corroborate a different theory of understanding or are antithetical to what you expected from the applied framework. I find it inconceivable to believe that the professor didn't, at the end of the lecture, go, by the way, make sure by this week you've read Beowulf. Or make sure by this week you've read this play. We're doing Midsummer Night's... Your syllabus will say, we're doing Midsummer Night's Dream in week 4. If you haven't read Midsummer Night's Dream, that's fucking on you.
Edward Said is writing about Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, which is a book that I had read, but a book that I'm sure that not many other people in the class had read, because again, this is a bunch of 18-year-olds. And let me tell you guys what his take is. His argument is that Mansfield Park is a novel about colonialism and imperialism. That's a little bit strange. That's not what Mansfield Park is about at all. And apparently he hyperfixates on one line where slavery is mentioned. And from this line, he concludes that Jane Austen is complicit in British imperialist expansion.
This is where we cross the line into stupid town, people. That's a bit harsh, but I'm gonna stand by it. Because she talks about Edward Said on Mansfield Park. Back again. Right below Capital by Thomas Piketty, which I'm fucking mad that I bought that book, by the way, because in an interview he said he doesn't even agree with it anymore. That black book down there, right there, that's Mansfield Park. You might notice the fact that those two books there go together, and it's for a very important reason. Because Edward Said talked about Mansfield Park and talked about Jane Austen's writing in the context of the British Empire. It was in his book Culture and Imperialism. Shocker. But Pens and Poison has a fundamental misunderstanding of why this critique takes place. And the reason I can tell that is because she says the line, he zeroes in on a line that implies slavery. And it's only one small... And she's implying that it's only one small part of the book, so how did you even get the critique? The point of Edward Said's critique, his entire thesis statement, is that the book is engaging with the fact that the ideas of slavery were only a small bit of forethought or a small aspect of the British people's engagement in their own wealth. And that largely in British social consciousness, in the British zeitgeist at the time, there was a lack of engagement with the means that generated their wealth. Right? So what do I mean by this? The reason that the line is about the colonial garden. The reason that plays such a small part in the book is because there's a not only geographical but a moral separation between the two that Austen tries to present a critique on to some degree. It's small because British people are okay with their wealth. When you are geographically separated from the horrors of slavery, you tend to think about it less. That's a fact. When you can benefit from this absurd amounts of money that is made by exploitation of sugar farming and the slave trade, it occupies that small, tiny little bit at the back of your brain, but it never manifests itself fully. Right? It creates an underlying tension throughout the novel, where now you as the reader are aware that everyone who is wealthy and able to concern themselves with such banalities of domestic drama that exist at Mansfield Park are doing so against the backdrop of the fact that their wealth was made woefully immorally through the exploitation of slavery and labor. That is what the critique is, and it's a critique of the British Empire. It is the fact that the British Empire extracts wealth from other countries through horrid, horrific means, and then not only brings it back to British shores, but pays it absolutely no mind as immoral because it's happening far away from you. Furthermore, Said doesn't even, hate on Mansfield for this. He just presents it as a critique of her work. There's a quote here. This is from Said. What I have called the rhetoric of blame, so often now employed by the subaltern, minority, or disadvantaged voices, attacks her, and others like her, retrospectively, for being white, privileged, insensitive, and complicit. Yes, Austen belonged to a slave-owning society, but do we therefore jettison her novels as so many trivial exercises in aesthetic frumpery? Not at all. I would argue, if we take seriously our intellectual and interpretive vocation to make connections, to deal with as much evidence as possible, fully and actually, and to read what there is there and what there is not there. So he shows that the reason he engages with this critique of Mansfield Park specifically and Jane Austen's work is not to say, oh well, Jane Austen's horrible for benefiting from the British Empire. It's to say that Jane Austen actually presents the connection between slavery and the British Empire in a way that was incredibly realistic. I've written about this in papers, and I've written about this in exams, and I'm going to link some sources in the description for you to go read it about yourself, because it's really important that you understand this critique and why the critique is so small. And I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of how this criticism has operated, and that's possibly why she didn't engage with it so much. And she also says a bunch of Columbia alums didn't read Mansfield Park before coming to the university, which I find fucking hard to believe.
Okay, so I think maybe this is an anomaly. Maybe the professor is just crazy, but then I start taking more and more English classes, and we're reading Karl Marx, we're reading Judith Butler, we're reading all these theorists who are flooding the English curricula, but not actual novels or poems or books themselves. And it seems to me that the theorists we're reading also have very little to do with literature, such as Karl Marx or Judith Butler.
Okay, alright, okay, now you're fucking trolling, you know what I mean? Karl Marx and Judith Butler don't have anything to do with literature? That is demonstrably false, okay? Let's talk about Karl Marx for a second. Very, very famous philosopher, economist, and theorist. What does Karl Marx have to do with literature? This is actually a valid question if you haven't taken a literary theory course. However, she has a master's degree in English literature, so, you know, it's a bit perplexing. Anyway, economic critique of literature is something that has to be introduced once literature, and then by extension, education and information and knowledge, are commodified. That's just the truth, right? The understanding of how literature is circulated, the understanding of how costs, pricing, economic stability affect the flow of information and the access and ability for people to educate themselves and to therefore respond to the power structures that may keep them oppressed and critically think about things in their daily life is an integral part of literature. Because books are a commodity. To buy a book, right? Let's put it like this. In the UK, college costs 9,000 something a year plus a maintenance loan. And if you want to go to a good school, you would likely have to move for it, right? So, for a lot of people, that's not feasible. So, what do you do to educate yourself? Well, you have to read. That is a fundamental way of doing that. But reading is now, rather than being a free exchange of information, reading is a product that you buy, and it is dictated by market prices. Stores will stock books that are popular and sell well. They'll obviously stock a selection of classics, but they will be dictated in price by economics. Furthermore, stories engage with characters that live in society, right? Not every book is a fantasy book where a character lives in a made-up world. These characters live in the same economic conditions as you and me, and so the ability to understand how they engage with that is important for understanding literature and the world around us. What do I mean by this? One of the integral theories that I think is really important to literary theory that Karl Marx came up with is the idea of the base and the superstructure, right? In that any changes to an economic base will have ripple effects that will alter the cultural conditions of the superstructure. So, and that is kind of true, you know what I mean? If there's a ton of upsale and okay, so here's how I'll describe it in a way that I think actually would corroborate your point if it wasn't completely fucking dumb. A lot of people who are on the conservative side argue that movies have put in woke because everyone wants woke, right? Or that movies are failing because everyone wants woke. Well, here's the thing. The minute woke ideology starts to succeed in being put into movies, they will start selling well, and that will fuel these changes in the superstructure. And the minute that starts to fail, and the economic base changes, those ideologies will be changed and removed from movies, right? It's the idea that cultural traditions, because of the fact that large media companies and large publishing companies own and control the dissemination of information, changes in what sells and changes in the economy affect changes in culture. And not only are we victim to this, and our experience of literature is victim to this, characters within the novels are victim to this. They are victims to their own economic systems. This is incredibly important. This is why there are so many dystopian novels that deal with cultural issues but also economic issues. You know what I mean? Let's get back to the fucking video. I'm gonna have a heart attack.
And the more classes I took in the Columbia English department, the clearer it became to me that these professors just wanted to use literature as a force of resistance against illiberal forces to make our society a just world for all.
These professors wanted to use literature as resistance. No one else has ever used literature as resistance. It's only woke professors. Henrik Ibsen, no literature as resistance against patriarchal structures. None. Zong, I'll put the cover up on screen. No resistance against the silencing of subaltern voices. None. No, the literature is the main vehicle for resistance because it is information. It is a ability to teach and an ability to learn. It is the main way that you can resist oppressive power structures because it gives you the tools to understand why they're oppressive. The Grapes of Wrath, absolutely no resistance from the Dust Bowl farmers during the Great Depression. None. Anna Akhmatov's work, no resistance to Soviet fascism. None. What are we doing? Yeah, it's woke professors that did that. Fuck. I'm getting too angry. I need to calm down.
The promotion of social justice cannot be the sole aim of literature. It's only one tiny component of a really broad humanistic tradition. But if you ask anyone in my department, literature was inseparable from social justice. I looked into reading lists across my English classes, and there was always so much literary theory, but very little literature itself. And I started to see that a lot of English departments had replaced literature with theory, and they had done it so slyly that no one seemed to have noticed.
So this is where we get to a little bit more on the claim that, you know, all the reading lists are theory and all of the, you know, it's all woke, it's all literary theory, there's no actual literature. And this is why I'm going to talk a little bit more here in depth about the way that academia is structured and why I think it's really important to understand what you're supposed to be getting out of each stage of your education, right? So, again, the understanding that Pens and Poison has of literary education seems to me to be very rooted in the idea of high school English class, where you read the book and talk about what you think the book meant, and it's all about your internalized meaning of the literary story. The way an undergraduate degree is structured is to engage with and understand the fundamental underpinnings of literary criticism. It is to develop not so much your reading of a book, but your approach to reading, right? It is to understand the traditional power structures and societal structures that these authors wrote in, what conditions would have led to the messages, theming, and underpinning motifs within their book, and how those books can either function as critical or not critical of those power structures. The reason why doing your undergraduate in literature is so important is to familiarize yourself with these terms and to familiarize yourself with novels in which they apply. Edward Said is important because Mansfield Park is a novel where the critique of imperialism is spelled out pretty well. However, it's also engaging with a specific time period and a specific framework, right? Once you get to masters, you start developing on that theory and maybe being able to combat it with other examples. But it's really when you get to PhD where you're able to then, upon having understood and coalesced this foundation of literary theory, develop your own interpretations of text. I feel the main problem that she would have had with her undergraduate and with her masters is that she's trying to jump the gun way too fast. She's read all of these literary theories and has stuck to a very narrow-minded understanding of literature, which is this humanist tradition. And these literary theories, because of the fact that they rely so heavily on external systems, are, to the most part, antithetical towards that idea. And so I think what's happened is that there is a lack of, not a lack of engagement, but a lack of foundation when these critiques are being made. And, you know, she talks about the fact that she got a C on one paper that was about patriarchal structures and an A on another paper that was about dismantling gender things. And it's because in the undergraduate setting, you're expected to engage with these structures. Now, you can disagree with them, as I have done many times on my undergraduate papers. I have a real problem. So, I've disagreed with a lot of theories and a lot of times. I've disagreed with a lot of literary theory during my undergraduate, and the reason why I know this is okay is because I had an understanding of the reasons and theory that underpins what I was talking about. So I understood Apter, I understood Spitzer, because a lot of my comparative literature degree was about translation. So Apter and Spitzer, that were these two seminal texts in literary translation, I had read and fully understood. So when I made my critique of other literary theorists, it was predicated and developed from an understanding of why certain things work and why certain things don't. An example of this that I'll give was in the reading of a novel or a short story. I think it's the actual term is hagiography. The life and struggle of our mother Valata Petros, which was a 17th century Ethiopian hagiography about a religious leader. Now, there was a professor called Dr. Wendy Belcher, I think? Yeah, Dr. Wendy Laura Belcher, who had written a translation about the text that specifically implied that Valata Petros was in a queer relationship with her number two. And the reason she did this was because of X number of words that could have been translated in a certain way, and other passages that did in actuality probably signal to a repressed queer desire, if to be translated that way. However, a number of other scholars disagreed with her work because they had a deeper understanding of the Gers language. I think I'm pronouncing that right, but it's the language that underpinned the original text, and a better understanding of the Ethiopian cultural conditions that informed the material aspects of the text. And so I actually disagreed with Belcher's interpretation, because a lot of her translations were a reach. Not only that, I think the idea of an underpinning queer desire that was so explicit in her own translation was sort of antithetical to the nature of Valata Petros as a martyr who would die for her religious beliefs. It didn't really make sense for her to be signaling these semiotics of queer desire when she was so adherent to religious tradition. Now, is to say that that translation is not valid? Not really. Because fundamentally, those definitions of those words do exist. They might be on the fringes of those definitions, but they are real. You can actually define those words like that. However, it did seem a little bit cherry-picked. But that's an example of the fact that because I had these bases of not only a understanding of these translational critics like Apter, but an understanding of the cultural and material conditions that inform the text, which is another part of literary theory, this external aspect, I was able to provide a well-reasoned critique for why I disagreed with queer theory, which goes against your notion that it's woke professors that only care about writing for resistance. You can disagree with literary theory, you just have to do it correctly, and we're about to get to why I fucking know you don't do it correctly.
I took a class where I got a C on a paper where I argued in favor of patriarchal structures, and an A+ on a paper where I argued in favor of dismantling gender norms in the Oresteia. The first paper I had spent 2 weeks preparing. The second paper I wrote in 2 hours. The second paper was noticeably worse than the first paper, but it was the first paper that got a C because the professor claimed that my argument was simply incorrect.
Yeah, so this is the thing where she argues in favor of patriarchal structures, and then the A on the other paper. What she conveniently forgets to mention is what text she was arguing for patriarchal structures in. And I think that's really telling of the fact that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of how these critiques are, and if the book is used to critique these structures. Because if the book is a critique of patriarchal structures, you can't really argue in an essay about the book why it's not. You understand that? So I think that's really telling as to why that was left out of that section. But, you know, I could be conspiracy theorying a little bit.
And then finally, I got kicked out of my senior thesis program because I cited Camille Paglia, who is a controversial scholar who basically attacks a lot of the prevailing scholarship around Sylvia Plath. And of course, that was a big no-no, and my argument was misogynistic, and I was not allowed to pursue a thesis because I chose to cite this woman. By the way, check out Camille Paglia. She is really cool.
Wait, this professor refused to use the pronouns that are being requested or demanded by gender activists.
Yes.
Okay. Well, more power to him. Is what I say. Okay. This is get.
I was afraid it might hurt me. Okay, it just drove me absolutely crazy. Okay, and so on. All right. That women.
This is the real crux of the argument, which is why she did not continue in education. Camille Paglia. That name sound familiar to anyone? Well, it should if you're a fan of NAMBLA. Yeah, you didn't get done for quoting Camille Paglia because she's anti-Sylvia Plath. You got done because she's signed fucking NAMBLA manifestos that wanted to lower the age of consent laws to 14. And she was like really fucking anti-Sinead O'Connor. Paglia noted in several... I've got it all here. Paglia noted in several interviews, as well as Sexual Personae, her book, that she supported the legislation of certain forms of child pornography. Ah! Yeah, you didn't get done because Camille Paglia was a libertarian conservative that didn't like Plath. You got done because she was fucking pro-NAMBLA. For anyone that doesn't know, that's the North American Man-Boy Love Association. There's a South Park episode about it. Shout out Camille Paglia. She is really cool. On the record, by the way. Again, she's had a fundamental misunderstanding of what her course was supposed to do. She complains that there's an entire seminar that just went over theory, not literature. It's called Literature Theory 101. I had it. Everyone on my course had it. Everyone has done it. And it's because if you're going to teach literature, what else do you teach outside of the ability to dissect literature? I don't understand what she wants out of a literary education. That's what gets me. Is it to only talk about the symbolism and what it means to the characters in the text? If so, that's very high school. I'm sorry, it is. It genuinely is. It's a very high school understanding of how literature is supposed to work. And I disagree with formalism as an ideology. I don't like it, but it's just this understanding that there is only within the text what is in the text. It's not true, because the material conditions of the exterior inform the material conditions of the interior. That's just a fact when you're writing. The reason why so many books become a critique of capitalism is because a lot of those writers live and are victims of capitalism and the negative aspects of it. Funnily enough, a lot of the books, the business biographies that are written by billionaires and millionaires aren't critiques of capitalism. They're guides on how to make money. And that's the same. That is the inverse of this operation here. It's just one of them you perceive as woke because it's critical of power structures. However, there's an equal number of books by fucking Peter Thiel, by Jordan Peterson, these people who have benefited from these structures that are not critical of them, that write in favor of them, but they still write having the external factors of their social reality informing their books.
Instead, I was met with students and professors who only wanted to destroy everything I'd ever loved, calling it English literature in the process. Shortly after, I decided not to stay in graduate school, to drop out and find an environment where I could talk about the ideas that I love freely without having my thoughts suppressed by the radical Marxist mob. And that's why I'm here today on YouTube, spreading the love of literature, talking about the humanistic tradition, which has been forgotten in our study of English literature. Because to me, literature isn't a means of fighting for social justice, but a group of beautiful sentences that tells us something unique about human nature. And the forgotten purpose of literature lies in its relation to art and beauty. That's what we call the humanities. Guys, I'm tearing up because this actually makes me so sad that we don't teach literature in this way anymore and that it's become captured by radical Marxists. And I really, really want to do my part in restoring literature to its rightful place in the humanistic tradition.
But yeah, you can't say that you want to restore literature by ignoring hundreds of years of literary criticism. That's just not... It's not how it works. That's like saying, oh, I want to, restore music to what it was, but I have absolutely no understanding of why certain music genres work the way that they do. Either way, I think I'm actually going to make a part 2 to this, where I go through some of her essays, and I maybe talk about this a little bit more, and about this, like, woke fucking nonsense. But this is going to be part 1, and there will be an essay on the blog specifically related to this topic, so if you like it, please, 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 please go read my blog, please! My shit has been bombing so hard recently! Please, you have to go fucking read my blog, please. I'm begging you, it's really good. It's really good. I got some stuff on reform, I got some stuff on economics out now. You can educate yourself and do economic critique. Please go read my blog. Seriously, please go read my blog. I'm fucking begging you, please. Alright, that's it.